now to our third etude. This is Grigoriev number 58. It's marked Allegro moderato, so moderately fast. It's not too fast. And keep in mind here we're in 2/2 or cut time, so the half note will be getting the beat here. Also take note of the key. We're in the key of D flat major or B flat minor is really where our tonal center is for most of this etude is B flat. It has kind of that darker sound that we talked about for those other etudes. So watch out for G flats especially. Those are going to come up a lot, and those are ones that can be easy to miss. So like with all the other etudes, make sure you practice your scales inside and out so you know them like the back of your hand, and that when you play this, it will be nothing to it. So we have some more markings here. We start forte nice and strong, and we have patetico, which might seem like it means like pathetic, and in a way it does, but maybe not in the way you think. It actually kind of a way that we would think of it as is with great emotion. So this is not something we want to play, kind of half-heartedly, but we really want to have a lot of excitement and energy and emotion in this etude. So, and if you notice in the first two bars, this is kind of one of our main ideas, just two notes, bum, bum. Make sure that the accent is on the second note because it's very clearly written there. I feel like what a lot of players will probably try to do is, maybe unintentionally even, is have the accent on the first note, that low note, bum, bum, but make sure it's bum, bum. And if you're having trouble getting that low F to speak for the very first note, you can even just work your way down there. So you start on the F above that, the octave above that, and just work down the B flat minor or D flat major scale. You can just work all the way down just like that, and it's going to make it a lot easier to make sure you're getting those low Fs to pop out really nicely, because you're starting somewhere really familiar, that F, and just below the staff, and then you're working all the way down just like that. So doing that will really help with the technical side of things of this etude. Looking ahead, so you probably noticed I'm adding a little bit of dynamic contrast again that's not written. I would encourage that, of course, because just like the last etude number 2, there's not a lot that's written here for phrasing and dynamics. So we want to make sure we add some of our own, so there's some interest and we really stand out in the performance. So I'm adding a subito piano at the start of these 8th note runs here, and then crescendoing all the way through for a bit of excitement. The key here on these 8th note runs all throughout this etude is think really light tongued. I feel like sometimes we think we have to really hammer out the notes to make sure they're heard really clearly, but in this case, and with the speed we're going, we just want to make sure we're not getting too bogged down on each of these notes. We want to make sure we stay kind of light on our feet. So make sure that you're not being too heavy-handed with how you're tonguing this, how you're playing through this. Obviously, another great way to make sure you're getting all these notes really clearly is, of course, to slur it, and that's a great way to go about the very beginning of this etude. Okay, so now we're on to section 2 of this third etude, and just right from the start we have the same idea from the very beginning, bum ba, bum ba. Another way you can practice that, by the way, to really simplify everything and make sure the half note is getting the accent, is just to play it on one single note, just kind of a monotone, so playing it on like an F, ba ba, ba ba, ba ba, and making sure that the accent is on the second note there. So something that's a little bit different about this occurrence is a couple of these quarter notes, like the very first one we have, is higher than the half note. And generally speaking in music, and just with how acoustics and all that works, generally higher notes are going to be heard louder than the lower notes. So I would actually encourage you to just back off just a hair on these higher notes, these higher quarter notes here, just so that we can get a really good accent on the lower notes, and you don't have to, bark it out too loud on the lower note and have a split tone or not a very great sound. So just back it off just a hair, and that's going to make it a lot easier, and you're going to really hear the accent and the contrast between those two different notes there. And so again, on the eighth note runs, I'm starting doing some subito piano and crescendo all the way through. I would encourage, if you can, to not breathe at all in these eighth note passages here until after that B flat whole note. Just because the idea that's happening here, it's moving all the way, and then it's kind of finishing on that B flat whole note. So if you breathe in there, you might have to leave out a note or two. So we want to try to avoid that if possible. So that's why I'm starting piano, so that I can make sure I have enough air to make it all the way to the end of that phrase. All right, moving on. Now we have a lot of eighth notes here, a big eighth note passage, and we're starting a mezzo forte, so that's something that's already written in, so make sure we follow that. So we're not starting as loud as we did at the very beginning, but still is a pretty full sound. And for this, I would also encourage to not breathe at all in these eighth note passages if possible. If you do have to, if there's any way to, you can kind of sometimes do like a little sniff breath through your nose when you're playing. It's kind of tricky to do, and it's something that really takes some time to work on, but that'd be one of the options you can do, is just whenever you're playing, you just to get a little sniff breath through your nose, and then it makes it a little bit easier. You don't have to leave some big gaps in the music. But I think the biggest thing I would encourage is to just not breathe through that if you can, and at least until you get to the quarter notes after that section there. And so again, I'm leading all the way to those accented quarter notes, and make sure that when you get to the quarter notes there, you make the accent really clearly on ba da ba da ba da ba da, rather than ba da ba da, right? We don't want it on the second and fourth notes, we want it on the first and third notes. And make sure that the second and fourth notes, the A flats, that those are still quarter notes in their length. Sometimes people might be tempted to ba da and clip off those. Make sure you keep them nice and long. Ba da ba da ba da ba da. All right. Okay, so moving on to this next section. As you can tell, it's very, very similar to the last section we did, almost identical in terms of the rhythm. We have these very long eighth note passages. The only difference here is we have it ending with two half notes rather than the four quarter notes. So same as before, we want to make sure we're moving, pushing the phrase all the way to the very ends there, to those long notes. And since we're starting this, if you could look at this, we're starting this a little bit lower than before. Instead of starting on A flat, we're starting on a low F. So that means we're going to be using more air when we're playing this. So that means that we want to start a bit softer than mezzo forte even, to make sure we can make it all the way through to the end of that phrase. Because ideally, you don't really want to breathe in between these eighth notes, since with the tempo we're going, there's not really an ideal spot to breathe for these. So, and of course, you can practice these slurred to make sure we have really great connectivity and really great tone quality and pitch on every note. But another thing you can do as well is you can actually change up the rhythm itself. So you can practice these eighth note passages as dotted 8 16th note rhythms. So sounds something like this. And so when you're doing that, for every group of 4 eighth notes that you're playing, or in this case dotted 8 16th note groupings, you're focusing on the first and third notes of the group. ba ba da ba da ba ba da ba da ba ba da ba da. And then you can also swap that rhythm and do the 16th note first. Ba da 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 da. Then you're focusing on the second and fourth notes of each grouping. So if you were playing it before and maybe you had consistently some notes that weren't speaking very well, this is a great way to work on that. So I'll play the swapped or reversed version of that. So hopefully that gives you an idea and some good tools that you can use when you're practicing these long eighth note runs. Okay, next section is pretty short, but some important things to note here. So again, make sure that we're getting really clear accents on the first and third quarter notes in the second and fourth bars. Ba-da, ba-da. And again, you can do even just blowing air through the horn and fingering and see if you can hear the accent. So if you can hear the air accent really clearly, then that means it's going to be heard nice and clearly out when you're playing it too. And you can probably tell when I was playing on the recording that I'm starting pretty soft at the top of those eighth note descending figures, so and then digging in as I go lower. And like I mentioned before, how the lower notes are typically softer, that means since you're descending on these eighth note figures, you want to really dig in and push on that crescendo a lot so that you can hear a crescendo happening. Really, really big on that. This next section, really all of this etude it's really important how you decide to implement your own dynamics, because I think that this one works really well if you start piano and then you crescendo all the way until the fermata note and then kind of let the fermata note decay. It adds just I think a lot more excitement musically, and it also just helps with the breathing as well. So just starting nice and kind of conservative on the start, and that's going to make it a lot more exciting when we're leading up into this really dramatic fermata, and then we go back into the recap of the first section again. All right, so now we're at the recap of the initial main melody, and so really pretty similar. In fact, it's exactly the same as before. And so a couple things you can think about here, which I didn't mention before. If you feel like you're having trouble with the timing on the eighth notes, one thing that you can do that I like to do sometimes is kind of thinking about little anchor points. So usually the best way to do that is think about where are your big downbeats. So we're in 2-2, so we're thinking 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and. So if you're practicing this slowly, you can think about starting on the eighth notes. And practicing it at that tempo, and then also just adding a little bit more accent on the notes that fall right on the downbeats. That can kind of help anchor your time and make things kind of fall right where they're supposed to be. So again, it's just ba 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 ba. And you can do that for all of these different eighth note sections too, just to make sure that your timing is spot on. we're on to the last section now. And here's just a little bit different. We have a little bit of variation from the very start of this etude. Again, from before, remember to not hammer out the top B-flat octave here too much, or the F that happens later, but really save that for the low accented note so we can hear that. In terms of dynamics and phrasing, what you can probably hear what I'm doing is on these 8-note passages that are ascending, I'm just adding a little bit of a decrescendo. So, ba, 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 and just kind of let the notes just float away up like that. And then I'm going to a subito forte after that. And then from there, starting soft on the last 4 bars, and then just building all the way until the very end, a really big and exciting finish for this etude. So again, for all of this, really all of these etudes, you don't have to do exactly what I'm doing in terms of the phrasing and dynamics that I'm adding, but I would encourage you to figure out something on your own that works. If you want to do the ones I'm doing, that's great. If you feel like you want to try something else differently, then that's great too. Just make sure you decide something, because we don't want to play any of our etudes really flat and boring. We always want to make sure that our music is really dynamic and interesting to listen to.